Hey, he said. Hey, John echoed as Carlton tousled John's hair. What, are you my granddad now? John made a half-hearted effort to straighten his hair while searching the crowd with his eyes. I'm surprised you came. Marla slapped him across the shoulder. I mean, of course you're going to come, Carlton corrected. I just don't know you've been busy. Too many girlfriends, am I right? How's New York? John asked, fishing for something to talk about as he straightened his clothes. Great! College, city, learning, friends. I was in a play about a horse. It's great. He bobbed his head in a rapid nod. Marla's in school too. In Ohio, Marla jumped in. I'm preemed. That's great, John grinned. Yeah, it's been a lot of hard work, but it's worth it, she said cheerfully, and John began to relax, falling back into the familiar pattern of their friendships. Marla was still Marla. Carlton was still inscrutable. Is Lamar around? Carlton asked, looking from face to face. Marla shook her head. I called him a few months ago, she said. He's on track to graduate early. But he's not coming? Carlton persisted. Marla smiled slightly. He said, I'm never, ever, ever setting foot in that town again. Not ever. Never for as long as I live. And you shouldn't, either. But he said we're all welcome to visit. In New Jersey? Carlton made a skeptical face, then turned his attention to Jessica. Jessica, what's up with you these days anyway? I heard you've got the dorm room to yourself now. John stiffened, suddenly aware of what Carlton was really asking. The light seemed blinding, the noise louder. Jessica glanced at John, but he didn't acknowledge her. Yeah, she said, turning back to the others. I don't know what happened, but I came home one day right after about 6 months ago, and she was packing what she could carry. She left me and John to clean up the rest. If we hadn't happened to walk in, I don't think she was even going to tell me she was leaving. Did she say where she was going? Marla asked, her brow furrowing. Jessica shook her head. She hugged me and said she'd miss me, but all she'd say was she had to leave. She wouldn't tell me where. Well, we can always ask her, Carlton said. John looked at him, startled. You've seen her? Carlton shook his head. Not yet. My plane just got in today, but she'll be here tonight. Jessica says she looks good. Right, John said. They all looked at him as if they could see what he was thinking. She looks good, but she doesn't look like Charlie. John, come help me in the kitchen, Clay called, and John broke away from the group relieved, but also fully aware he couldn't possibly provide any help in the kitchen. What's up? He asked. Clay leaned back against the sink and looked him up and down. Need me to open the ketchup bottle? John asked, growing nervous. High shelf? Clay sighed. I just want to make sure you're all right out there. What do you mean? I thought you might be nervous. I know it's been a while since you and Charlie talked. It's been a while since you and I have talked too, John said, unable to keep the edge out of his voice. Well, that's different, and you know it, Clay said dryly. I thought you might need a pep talk. A pep talk? John retorted. Clay shrugged. Well, do you? Clay stared at him firmly, but with kindness in his eyes, and John's nerves calmed. Jessica told you? He asked, and Clay tilted his head to the side. Some. Probably not all. Here. Clay opened the refrigerator door he had been leaning against and handed John a soda. Try to relax. You're here with friends. Those people out there love you. Clay smiled. I know, John said, setting the can on the countertop next to him. He eyed it for a second, but did not pick it up, feeling like if he drank it, he wouldn't be giving in, accepting everything he was told. It would be like taking whatever pill everyone else had already swallowed. John eyed the back door. Don't even think about it, Clay said abruptly. John didn't try to pretend it wasn't what he was thinking. Clay sighed. I know how hard this must be for you. Do you? John responded sharply, but Clay's expression didn't change. Stay and talk to her. I think you owe that to her, and to yourself. John's eyes were still fixed on the door. All of this heartache that you're putting yourself through, that can't be what you want. Clay leaned to the side, interrupting John's gaze. You're right, John said. He stood up straight and met Clay's eyes. This isn't what I want. He went to the back door and pushed it open, rushing down the concrete steps as though Clay might pursue him, then walking around the side of the house toward his car, his heart pounding. He felt a little lightheaded and completely unsure he was making the right decision. John! Someone called from behind him. The familiar voice sent a jolt through him, and he stopped, closing his eyes for a second. He heard her heels tapping on the stone walk, the sound vanishing as she crossed the grass to him. He opened his eyes and turned toward the voice. She was standing a few feet from him. Thanks for stopping, Charlie said. Her face was anxious, her arms wrapped tightly across her body like she was cold, despite the mild weather. I was just going to get my jacket, John said, trying to sound casual in the midst of an obvious lie. He looked her up and down, and she didn't move, like she knew what he was doing, and why. It's not her. She looked like some stunning cousin of Charlie's, maybe, but not her. Not the round-faced, frizzy-haired, awkward girl he had known almost all his life. She was taller, thinner, her hair longer, darker. Her face was uncannily different, though he could not have explained how. Her posture, even as she stood hugging herself in anxiety, was somehow elegant. As he looked at her, the first shock of recognition gave way to an acute revulsion. He took an involuntary step back. How can anyone think that's her? He thought. How can anyone think that's my Charlie? She bit her lip. John, say something, she said, pleading in her voice. He shrugged, holding both hands up in resignation. I don't know what to say, he admitted. She nodded. She uncrossed her arms as if she had just realized she was holding them that way, and began to pick at her nails instead. I'm so happy to see you, she said, sounding like she was about to cry. John softened, but tamped the feeling down. Me too, he said in a monotone. I missed you, she began, searching his face for something. John had no idea what he might look like, but he felt like stone. I had to get away for a while, she went on uncertainly. That night, John, I thought I was going to die. I thought you did, he said, trying to swallow the lump rising in his throat. She hesitated. You don't think I'm me? She asked softly at last. He looked down at his feet for a moment, unable to say the words to her face. Jessica told me, it's okay, John, she said. I just want you to know that it's okay. Her eyes were bright with tears. His heart lurched, and in an instant, the world came into a different focus. He gazed at the woman huddled in front of him, trying to suppress her sobs. The stark differences he saw in her were suddenly things that seemed so easily explained. Her shoes had heels, so she was taller. She was wearing a form-fitting dress, instead of her usual jeans and t-shirt, so she appeared thinner. She was wearing elegant clothing, and her gestures were confident, sophisticated, but it was all no more than if Jessica had given her the makeover she was always threatening. No more than if Charlie had just grown up. We've all had to grow up. John thought of the way he drove home from work, or had until this morning, the way he avoided ever driving past her house, or the sight of Freddy Fazbear's. Maybe Charlie had things she wanted to avoid. Maybe she just wanted to be different. Maybe she wanted to change, like you did. When you think of that moment, what it did to you, what must it have done to her? What kind of nightmares do you have, Charlie? He was seized by a sudden, visceral desire to ask her, and for the first time he allowed himself to meet her eyes. His stomach jolted as he did, his heart racing. Tentatively, she smiled at him, and he smiled back, unconsciously, mirroring her. But something frigid twitched inside him. Those aren't her eyes. John shifted his gaze, a calm coming over him. Charlie looked momentarily confused. Charlie, John said carefully, do you remember the last thing I said to you before you were trapped in the suit? She held his gaze for a moment, then shook her head. I'm sorry, John, she said. I don't remember a lot about that night. Whole pieces are just missing. I remember being in the suit. I passed out, I think, for hours. So, you don't remember? He repeated gravely. It seemed impossible that she could have forgotten. Maybe she didn't hear me. Were you hurt? He asked brusquely. She nodded silently, her eyes filling again with tears as she hugged herself. Maybe she was. John took a step closer to her, wanting suddenly, desperately, to promise her that everything would be all right. But then her eyes met his again, and he stopped, stepped back. She extended a hand, but he didn't take it, and again she crossed her arms over her body. John, would you meet me tomorrow? She asked steadily. Why? John said before he could stop himself, but she did not react. I just want to talk. Give me a chance. Her voice rose shakily, and he nodded. Sure, yeah, I'll meet you tomorrow. He paused. That same place, okay? He added carefully, waiting to see how she would reply. The Italian place? Our first date? She said easily, and gave a gentle smile. Her tears seemed to have stopped. Around 6? John let out a deep breath. Yeah. He met her gaze again, and did not look away, letting himself take rest in her eyes for the first time that night. She looked back at him, motionless, like she was afraid she might scare him away. John nodded, then turned and left without another word. He walked quickly back to his car, struggling to keep his pace even. It felt like he had done something wonderful, and also like he had made a horrible mistake. He felt strange, riding an adrenaline rush, and as he drove through the dark, he pictured her face again. Those weren't her eyes. Charlie watched him go, rooted to the spot as if it were the only place she'd ever stood. He doesn't believe me. Jessica had not wanted to tell her about John's strange yet adamant conviction, but his refusal to speak to her now, his unwillingness even to acknowledge her presence that day in the diner, was too bizarre to be dismissed. How can he think I'm not me? The taillights of John's car vanished around a bend. Charlie stared into the dark where he had been. not wanting to return to the bright, noisy house. Carlton would tell her a joke. Jessica and Marla would comfort her the way they had in the diner that day, when she had come to show them that somehow, impossibly, she had survived. The walk from her car, really Aunt Jen's borrowed car, toward the diner had felt like miles that day, her stomach fluttering anxiously, even though she knew, of course, that they would be happy to see her. How could they not be? Every step was stiff, uncertain. Every time she moved, it hurt. Her body sore all over from the day before, though there were no marks on her to show it. Even breathing was strained and unfamiliar, and she had a persistent feeling that if she forgot to do it, she would stop, die of asphyxiation, right there on the pavement, unless she was reminded. Take a breath. She could see them through the window as she made her way to the front of the diner, her heart racing, and then they saw her, and it was everything she had dared to hope. Marla and Jessica ran to the door, jostling over who would hug her first, crying at the sight of her living face. She let herself be wrapped in the warmth of their relief, but before they even let her go, she was looking for John. When she saw him, his back to the door, she almost called out his name, but something stopped her. She said something she could not hear, and she watched, incredulous, as he failed to come to her, clenching a spoon in his hand like a weapon. "John!" she called at last, but he did not turn around. Marla and Jessica ushered her out of the restaurant, making reassuring sounds that must have been words, and Charlie strained to see him through the window. He had not moved. How can he pretend I'm not here? A shock of pain hit her suddenly, yanking her back to the present, and Charlie hugged herself tightly, though it didn't really help. It was everywhere, sharp and hot. She clenched her jaw, unwilling to make a sound. Sometimes it eased to an ache she could push to the back of her awareness. Sometimes it vanished for days at a time, but always it came back. "Were you hurt?" John had asked. The first, the only sign he'd given that he might still care. She had been unable to reply. Yes, she could have said, "Yes, I was and still am. Sometimes I think I'll die of it, and what I feel now is just an echo of what it used to be. It feels like all my bones are broken. It feels like my guts are twisted and torn. It feels like my head has cracked open and things are leaking out. And it happens again and again." She clenched her teeth, taking deliberate breaths until it began slowly to recede. "Charlie, are you okay?" Jessica said quietly, appearing beside her on the sidewalk outside Clay's house. Charlie nodded. "I didn't hear you come over," she said hoarsely. "He doesn't mean to hurt you. He's just traumatized," Charlie snapped. "I know." Jessica sighed, and Charlie shook her head. "Sorry, I didn't mean to be rude." "I know," Jessica said. Charlie sighed, closing her eyes. He's not the one who died, and it did feel like dying. She could only remember that crucial night in fragments. Her thoughts were all scraps and whispers, hazy and muddled, everything circling slowly around a central point. A single unmistakable snapping sound of the spring locks. Charlie shivered and felt Jessica's hand touch her shoulder. She opened her eyes, looking helplessly at her friend. "I think he just needs time," Jessica said gently. "How much time can he need?" Charlie asked, and the words sounded like stone.